Can you tell me what inspired you to become involved with the war in Ukraine and the efforts that you're making?
It's really my kids, sitting on the couch with my kids, watching the network coverage, the news cycle, the constant cycle of images of Ukrainians enlisting, saying goodbye to their families and getting on buses to go fight in a war that everyone really believed would be over in 3 days. Just watching these people risk everything for, well, I don't, they don't really have a choice. It's a sort of an existential issue for them. So it's like watching these people just kind of commit to saying goodbye to their wives and children and going to fight in a war in which they probably were not going to survive. And the idea that something like that would happen in our lifetime, in this kind of, again, in our lifetime, in this sort of, what we like to think of as a civilized culture, the idea that a ground war like that would happen was really disturbing to me, particularly as a grandson of Eastern European immigrants who fought that fight more than 80 years ago and presumably settled it, that democracy, that even in Eastern Europe, of the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, that Russia and the United States had all agreed that Ukraine was a sovereign nation and would have its democracy. In fact, Russia pledged to defend it in exchange for Ukraine's vast arsenal of nuclear weapons. And as soon as Ukraine gave those up, obviously this strategic invasion began. And Maidan was sort of the turning point, I guess. And that's when things heated up again and got worse. And then obviously that's when Putin annexed Crimea and it all started and kicked off. And I just remembered my grandfather and his generation of people, the values and the principles that they had, that I realized I had done nothing to demonstrate to my own children. And this was something that I felt was close to home for us, not just as Ukrainians, but as Americans, that
as people
the
who
trend towards authoritarian regimes is increasing all over the world. And the first phase of that seems to be this kind of draw of misinformation and disinformation. And it's happening in America as well. Politics have become a team sport. As higher education sort of plummets in this country, people aren't really aware of the freedoms and the liberties, that they take them for granted. And I don't think that issue is any clearer than in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. Democracy is being threatened globally at the moment.
Yeah.
How many times have you visited Kyiv, Ukraine?
Total 5, since the war, 3.
Oh, bless you. And what can you explain a little bit about the two charities, United 24 and Blue Check, that you're involved with?
Well, Blue Check is essentially a pass-through for people who want to support Ukraine. We want to make it easy for them. We have a wonderful international law firm called Ropes and Gray, who vets and verifies all of the NGOs that we work with. The idea was really just Humanitarian Outcomes, which is a group out of the UK, which is kind of a watchdog group for humanitarian aid, published a report in June that said in June, 2.6 billion had been donated to Ukraine, and of that 2.6 billion, only around 6 million had actually made it to the active NGOs on the ground who were doing the work. So our model was to try to get into Ukraine, find out who those NGOs were, and create a pass-through for people who wanted to support them, and also try to raise money to support them. And that worked out really well. I'm working with some really effective people. Two of the guys on our team have over 30 years of experience in humanitarian aid, from Doctors Without Borders, Jason Cohn and Michael Goldfarb and Murphy Poindexter. And they just had a lot of connections in the embassies. Ultimately, we developed a relationship with the health ministry, and President Zelensky also was a little upset about that report, and wanted to start a fund of his own, and reached out to us to help him with that. And that's how I became involved in United 24, which is the president's fund.
Right. When you were over there, what did you see? Who did you meet, and how did it affect you?
The first time, I was only in Lviv. What I saw, or what I should say I noticed, was how much people were partying. There's this plaza in Lviv that I was just surprised, given what was going on in the country, how ebullient everybody seemed, that there was a real spirit. They were rallying, and college kids, I know these songs because I made a movie about Ukraine in 2003, and I'd listened to a lot of this music, and I've always really been into folk music and Zagania, gypsy music and things like that. And I was seeing these college kids singing these old Ukrainian folk songs, really drunk college kids singing these old Ukrainian folk songs. And that was just kind of really touching to me, how in touch with their own culture they had become, or maybe were already. I don't know enough about Ukrainian culture to know if that existed, but certainly the Russian invasion had caused this spike in Ukrainian self-love that was super impressive, and I think has fueled their defiance and their resilience and their courage. So super impressed by that. And then really that first trip was just about meeting these NGOs. So to meet people like Yolanta Prashalik, who's the director of the Lviv Symphony. Obviously, the symphony wasn't playing anymore because of the war and the pandemic, but these are all top-level classical musicians, so they practice every day, and they get together, and they decided that since they didn't have concerts, they should do something else with their time. So they pulled all the seats out of their theater, and they turned their orchestra into a distribution hub. So you have these like 70 people who are getting food, medical aid, everything, and they've just set up these vans with the distribution. So they practice at night, and during the day they're a distribution hub for humanitarian aid. People like Ukraine Needs You, who started a 24/7 mental health hotline for people who are suffering, getting professional therapists and psychologists to be on call 24/7 for people who had issues or wanted to talk. Starenki, I met that group, a group that looks after homebound elderly people. Leaky 24, a group that provides people with prescription medication. People forget during a war, you still need things like insulin. You still need all of these things to sustain life in the population. The Women's Center, which was a group that had previously worked in lobbying for gender equality and things like that. Now, because all of these women's husbands, there were suddenly all these single mothers, it became this incredible shelter system. Groups like Cash for Refugees, who were just literally dealing with the very acute refugee problem at that time, and finding ways to essentially just giving people money and helping them get to shelter and safety. just seeing how quickly they responded and how effectively was really impressive. And I think the first trip was really, Lviv was really just about being impressed with Ukrainians generally.
When was that exactly?
When was that?
Do you
Jeez.
remember?
No, I think it was April. Was it April? I'm terrible at this sort of thing. It's easy to find out.
Okay.
Videos of me all over the place.
Okay.
I think it was April.
Okay.
The second trip was Kyiv, and that was to meet the president and to visit Borodyanko and some of these, you know, more war-torn areas, and to sort of see firsthand what they were going through. The exciting part of that, obviously, was that I got to meet Zelensky, who's an inspiration to me, as someone that I deeply admire, and someone I really enjoyed spending a few hours with. But the darker part of that trip was, of course, we traveled to Borodyanka and Bucha, and we saw firsthand what had happened. In typical American fashion right now, there is this conspiracy theory that the war is not really happening. Well, I was there and I saw it. It is absolutely happening, and it is a horror show, particularly in those areas. I mean, if anyone cares to look at any of the video from Borodyanka or Bucha, it was really horrible. But it was also an amazing trip. It was really inspiring trip, meeting so many people who are doing such effective work. Andrei Stavnitzer and Olga Rudneva are working on a hospital called Superhumans, which is it's a hospital that will, give using an international collection of doctors, will give first-class care to Ukrainian victims of the war, and it also destigmatizes people who have suffered from the war or lost limbs. Specializes really in prosthetic medicine, because that's a really big deal right now. Meeting the first lady, and just sort of getting the word out. It's one of those things that I can't remember the term I heard for it, but the people are getting tired of it, which is hard to imagine, but true. It's like people tire of bad news, so you find different ways to tell the story or to remind them of what those other people are going through.
They get fatigued, don't they, from this sort of onslaught of just 24/7. I mean, myself, I've been involved with various people, Ukrainians, and you do your little bit where you can. You do it on your Instagram, or you do it wherever you can. But after a while, you find yourself getting caught up with everyday life in our Western safe world.
Sure.
And then you're reminded of something, and then you've got to bring it back, and you've got to just not ignore the fact that this is going on. Yeah, I want to ask you, Liev, were there any times when you're out at these various locations which you've expressed were, deeply affected by the bombing, where you actually felt scared, where you felt frightened as a human being, where you felt under threat of at any time, something could happen? I mean, you're with the number one target, aren't you, really? If you're with President.
Yeah, no, I wasn't. There was one point we were on a train. We took the train from Poland to Kyiv. And there was one point we had to stop on the train and turn out all the lights. And that made me a little nervous. The idea of being stuck in a train, which was it occurred to me that a train's a kind of easy target.
Yeah.
And I didn't like the idea of being stuck inside something that wasn't moving.
And were you
probably the worst of it.
Were you with the president and his people at that time?
No, I wasn't with the president.
Okay, but still. And I guess, how has it changed you or informed your perspective on life, or as a father, how has it altered you? Has it?
Well, I was going through a bad patch, when this all went down personally as well. I just finished. I'd been doing Ray Donovan for 7 years, and that ended. And when something like that ends, you kind of, you kind of, I don't know how to describe it. It's just when you do something for that long, you don't really anticipate not doing it, and then you're not doing it, and you're like, well, who am I now, and what is my job? And for so long, that was my job, and that was my family, and I miss them very much. And also, my father passed away that year in a kind of in a sort of surprising way, and I think I was just a little bit spun. And then the war, which was a huge shock to me. It was like a gut punch for some reason. It really felt like, how is this happening on top of the circus of our politics in America, that now this was happening? That something felt really chaotic about and hard to relate to about the world. And I think my first instinct was kind of fold in on myself a little bit and become depressed and hide. And I think if it were not for my kids and my girlfriend and having other people around me kind of poking at me, going, get off the couch, stop moping. Or that thing that always functions in me, which always, at some point, I become self-conscious and aware that I'm that I'm not alone. I think I spend most of my life thinking I'm alone, and then somebody reminds me that I'm not. And in this case, it was my kids, and I realized that, whoa, shit, there's something, they need help. They need to know how to process this. And like, they heard that we're Ukrainian. So what does that mean? Am I, could I say goodbye to my kids like that, go off and fight? Absolutely not. I'm American. And it said, it occurred to me that it's because I'm American that this is important, that because the democracy, the freedoms and the liberties that I always think of this country as a nation of grandchildren. And we've had a few administrations recently which were sort of down on immigration, but immigration is what this country is about. It's how it formed. It's who we are. It's the greatest part of our system is that if you're down on your luck anywhere in the world, you've got a shot here.
Yeah.
Anybody's got a shot here.
Yeah.
And that's one of the best things about Americans. And we forget our best qualities.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things I just wanted to remember. Man, I wouldn't fucking be here talking to you right now if my grandparents, if some guy hadn't gone out of a cart selling zippers and buttons on Orchard Street or something like that, so that I could go to school and have the shot that I have. And, it just felt like we've got to respect that system. We've got to protect that system. And it feels like we owe a little bit of a debt to our aunts, to our grandparents who fought for the freedoms and the liberties that we're enjoying now, that I think a lot of us take for granted. And I mean, imagine in Europe, if that gate, which I consider Ukraine to be a gate to Western Europe, is occupied with this authoritarian regime, how that's going to change the world picture, how those kinds of governments, those kinds of administrations, rather, seem to be popping up all over Europe and America.
In South America.
And I think that those of us who value the systems that we live in, that allow us to make art, that allow us to raise our children, that allow us to educate ourselves, allow us to speak the language, allow us to choose who we have relationships with, allow us to choose where we worship. Those of us who care about that stuff, I really think, really need to consider how much we care about it.
Yeah, exactly.
And then whether or not we're willing to protect it, defend it.
And sustain it for future generations. I remember going with my father and doing Meals on Wheels when I was a wee little lad, and it was so incredible to meet these survivors of the Second World War who were longing for kind of company, and I was entranced with their stories of the war. And you know, some of them had very physical, quite shocking scars, but it was really important, I thought, to be taught about empathy and about history and about the state of the world. And I'm really
glad to continue. That generation is extraordinary to me. The sacrifices that generation made, like those guys that you're talking about, those you know, that we have them in America too. That generation of people who didn't hesitate for a second about defending their ideals and values. And it was just one of those things that I thought about when I was still watching the news on the war on CNN. I thought, geez, my grandfather, he would have been up in arms about this. He would have been over there fighting. And I thought, I'm not anywhere near that. And that generation in particular, those guys you're talking about, who survived the Blitzkrieg and all that stuff, they're really extraordinary people.
They're made of the right stuff for sure. I could talk to you all day, and you've got lots to do, but I know we've only got a certain amount of time. Give me a definition of courage. What does courage mean to you?
I think, you know, watching these guys get on a bus to go off and fight in a war in which they're wildly outmanned and outgunned is extraordinary to me. And I don't have that level. I would like to imagine that I would make that choice for my children, but I thought about it and I wouldn't. I don't want to say goodbye to my kids. I don't think I could stand the idea of not seeing my kids again. I couldn't. And I thought about that kind of courage, and it occurred to me that it's some awareness of what lasts, what matters most, and that's real courage to me. It's some awareness of values and some awareness of what matters most and what matters to you, and being willing to fight for it, to die for it. And it's just something that our generation is completely lost touch with. And I know I have. But that level of courage that someone, you know, because when you're a kid, you always think, geez, if someone put me up against the wall and said, you know, it's you or your mom, what would I do? You know, I'd always imagine those scenarios like that because I had a very vivid imagination when I was a kid. And it's happening. It's happening to people.
But I think you're being slightly hard on yourself because it's such a surreal thing to talk about. I mean, it's when you see these people who can lift cars off their children if they're hurt. I think it's something that, you know, it's something that you only would truly know, God forbid, if you were faced with it, and then you just react. I mean, but anyway, I very much value your consideration, and you've clearly contemplated this with depth and effort. So, you know, but I thought
about Zelensky, like, you know, he made this decision, which surprised a lot of people, which was that he was going to be the first leader in Ukraine's history that wasn't going to jump on a helicopter and escape in the night. Not only was he going to stay, but he was committed to staying in Kyiv. And Kyiv was supposed to topple in 3 days. And it was very important to him. It was symbolic to him that he be in Kyiv. And, you know, a military leader strategically could move around, and that's probably the smart thing to do to stay safe. But he was committed to holding Kyiv, holding his seat of power and not moving. And I wonder about the courage that took for an actor who played a president, then runs for office and becomes a president and goes, holy shit, now this is real. And it occurred to me, because, people don't often say very nice things about actors, but it occurred to me that an actor is sort of uniquely suited for that moment, because he understands that the second act absolutely has to be Henry V.
Right.
He has no choice. He knows how that play is going to go. He knows he knows history. He knows dramatic literature. He knows that he has to be a stand-up guy in that moment. And it's about committing to those values, that what he believes in as an artist, as a man, as a leader, he commits to the thing that he believes in, even if his life is at risk, that, no, I know that I have to do this the right way. And I think that's real courage. Like, standing up for what you believe in. It's easy to talk about. It's more complicated to do. And I think what Zelensky has shown us, it's actually easier to do than you might think.
And the fact that his wife remained, the first lady remained. Are there children there as well?
I couldn't tell you.
Okay. Extraordinary. Just the opposite. How do you define cowardice? Being a coward?
Violence. It was one of my favorite things. One of the most interesting things about Ray Donovan playing that role, because everybody sort of saw him as such a tough guy, but he was just constantly living in fear of being revealed. And I think that's the thing that violence, it's always the more scared person throws the first punch. And I think that's of being afraid to sit in the moment and see what happens, being afraid to work it out, being afraid to love, being afraid to reach out, being afraid to look for a solution, being afraid to find common ground, being afraid to change. The result is usually violence. And I think personally, I think that's what we're seeing coming from Putin. He's backed into a corner.
How do you adjust to normal life, having been there? How do you go from this extraordinary exposure to something that's so real and so present every day, not just, I can dip in there on a weekend, but how do you adjust when you come back and then and you're dealing with Hollywood and you're dealing with, all the stuff that we take for granted? Does it take you a few days, or are you just constantly fueled by this? What's the process, if you know and can answer?
Well, it's kind of an acute problem, so it does keep you busy if you want it to. And then also there's kids. I find that kids are like the most constantly humbling experience you can have. So anytime I kind of lose touch with reality, they're my Machiavellian little 14-year-olds right there to remind me.
Right on. Is there anything, that I haven't sort of asked you that you would like to speak about with regards to this work, you've been very thorough, but is there anything else that isn't out there that I can help, facilitate out there? Or are you?
No, I appreciate your questions on courage and cowardice, because I never thought of it that way, particularly in terms of like having the courage to trust your instincts, having the courage to care, to know that it is in our better nature. It is in who we are as human beings to want to look out for each other. And I just trust that. It's something that I've always struggled with. I've always struggled with being a social person. I've always struggled with keeping in touch. I've always struggled with reaching out. And I think one of the best things this work has taught me is how valuable it is. And I don't mean on the scale of raising money for Ukraine. I mean on the scale of reaching out to your friends and remembering that that's our nature, that like it is our nature to care about each other, and it is our nature to be compassionate towards each other. And how much, you know, as the more I think about your question bouncing around the back of my head, how much that is courage, that is real courage to be kind, and how its opposite is violence.
Do you know if there's any projects going on in Hollywood which are sort of covering this or being developed with this in mind? With, you know, I mean, Zelensky is extraordinary on so many levels. Have you heard of anything going on, buzzing around? Would you like?
I'm sure there is. No, you know, I'm way too tall to play Zelensky.
Okay.
Don't tell him I said that. Maybe I could play Yermak. Maybe Ben Stiller could play him, and I could play Yermak. But it's not something that I've thought about in any kind of creative way at all. Right. And that was like the first things that came at me were people saying, "Do you want to do this project on storytellers and people in Ukraine?" I was like, "Fuck, man, this is not an art thing." And I now realize now it is. Like, I'd like to find an NGO of people in Ukraine who are making films that are about that are Ukrainian outreach, that are the Ukrainians speaking to the world and helping to sort of spread the narrative of who they are and what they're going through. But at the time when this all started, I was like, the last thing I want to do is relate to this in any kind of creative way. It just seemed too acute.
Yeah, I guess not. Well, I'm deeply touched by the fact that you've given me this time and given us this time, and really pleased as well. It says so much about you that you turned up at Guy's place and on your own without all the fucking fuss of that stuff, because we try and
keep... His dog bit me.
And his dog beat you.
His fucking dog bit me. I was trying to help his dog out of a bad spot. It's healed up now. I wanted to show you how horrible it was. I tried to get his dog out of a bad spot and she bit me.
I know, he sent me a picture. Have you got the picture?
Yes, everything.
My first thought was, "Oh fuck, we will get sued and we've got no."
That's what I said. That's all. No, it's all right, Guy. It's all right. We can solve it all in court. We'll be fine.
Lastly, this is what I want to ask you: are you hopeful?
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
I know they're going to win, and I know that, and I feel like, you know, it's a matter of time, though. You know, and that's the problem: is do we have the time? Do we have the patience? Can we withstand all the shit we're going to go through? Because I do think truth has a way of leveling everything, you know. It's just the truth will out. It really is. It's one of those situations, and people often ask me what I mean by that, and it's like you look at the bedrock of Russian nationalism are the mothers of these young cadets in the military schools, and these mothers back in April were saying to the heads of the school, "Please don't send our sons to Ukraine." And the administrators of those schools were saying, "No, we'll never. We would, of course, we wouldn't send your kids to Ukraine." Those kids all got sent in the first wave, and they're all dead. And now those mothers are now trying. Well, they've stopped trying to find their kids. I think they've acknowledged now that they're dead, and that's folding in on itself. You know, it's the civil society in Russia is starting to become aware, even with the hermetically sealed Kremlin media. They're starting to realize that they're involved in something bigger, more ominous, and more sinister, perhaps, than they thought. And I think that's the thing about the truth. It just has a way of coming out. In this country, it's unbelievable what people think and they can say. Like, people just feel like, now the new trend is you just say whatever you want and it doesn't matter. Get elected, it's a team sport, right? So it's just a race to the goal and you can say anything you want. But the thing is that hopefully what's happening, and I think maybe what we saw a little bit in the last election, is that people were voting for candidates, and that the truth is kind of, over time, it's making it finds its way into the conversation. And I think that's what's going on in Ukraine. And I just think there's no denying the truth there. it's too big. It's too big a lie to suppress.